The courtroom felt like a sealed jar of nerves, packed tight on creaking wooden benches while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain needled the tall windows, and every gust shoved a cold draft under the doors that smelled of wet asphalt and damp wool. Near the aisle sat the K-9 team, a veteran handler with quiet, coiled stillness, pressed uniform, boots planted, hands resting loose, eyes sweeping the room like a slow camera pan. Beside him lay his dog, a disciplined shepherd mix in a working vest, breathing steady, gaze alert without being loud. In this town, people said the dog could read lies the way others read lips, and the handler never argued. He just watched. When the little girl entered, the air changed. She was small for her age, hair brushed too neatly, cardigan buttoned wrong by nervous hands. She walked like someone trying not to take up space, chin lifted anyway, dignity held together by willpower. An adult guided her by the shoulder, steering her with a touch that looked polite to strangers and heavy to anyone who'd learned the difference. The dog's nose lifted, not sniffing wildly, just tasting the room. His eyes tracked the girl, then flicked to the adult's hand, then to the adult's face, and lingered there. The handler didn't move, but his posture did. He shifted half an inch, enough to place his body between them and the aisle, a silent, practiced protection. The girl's gaze slid past the lawyers, past the judge, past the crowd, and landed on the dog like he was the only honest thing in the building. In the brief lull before a clerk called the next name, she took a step closer, small shoes whispering on the polished floor, and crouched as if to pet him. Instead, she leaned in until her lips nearly brushed his ear and whispered something no one else could hear. The dog's ears snapped forward. His whole body went statue still, muscles locked under the vest. Then the sound came, low, controlled, not a bark, but a warning, a growl that cut through the room's murmurs like a wire pulled tight. He didn't bare teeth, he didn't lunge. He simply announced, with instinct, that danger was present. He turned his head a fraction, stare fixed past the rail toward a man in the second row who wore his confidence like a badge. People noticed the movement and pretended they hadn't. A few laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that tries to erase what it can't explain. The adult's fingers tightened on the girl's shoulder. The handler saw it all in one blink. The girl's whisper, the dog's freeze, the adult's micro-flinch, and the direction of that stare. Color drained from the handler's face. His chair scraped back so hard it squealed. He stood, eyes distant, and without a word he broke into a run, boots striking tile, leaving the dog planted like a guard at the child's side as the courtroom stared after him and the door swung open. Outside, the courthouse looked like a postcard someone had laminated. Against reality, white columns scrubbed clean, flags snapping bright in the rain-washed air, flower beds arranged with military symmetry as if color itself could keep secrets buried. The steps were crowded with smiling local officials who knew exactly where to stand for cameras. Their handshakes practiced, their laughter timed to the click of shutters and the chime of the building's front doors. A deputy held an umbrella for the mayor. A councilman clapped a reporter on the back. Everyone spoke in that light, neighborly tone that said, "We're fine here. Nothing to see. Keep it moving." Hard cut, like a film splice. Because what was happening inside didn't match the picture outside, and the town couldn't afford for those two worlds to touch. The veteran officer, Officer Mason Ward, stood just beyond the awning where rain threaded down in thin lines. His face calm in a way that wasn't softness, but control. He didn't look like a man hunting drama. He looked like a man trained to prevent it. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, hair clipped close, eyes that stayed steady even when the world around him tried to shake loose. His uniform sat neat without being showy, and his hands, those hands, never fidgeted. They rested, ready. Beside him, his canine partner, a shepherd mix named Riot, watched everything with the quiet intensity of a creature that didn't need words to read a room. Riot wasn't a mascot, wasn't a good boy for photos, and Mason didn't treat him like one. The dog was a sensor, a compass, a living alarm system tuned to what humans ignore. Sweat turning sour, breath hitching behind smiles, the tiny tremor that leaks out when someone is lying through their teeth. Riot's ears rotated, tracking the courthouse doors, tracking the foot traffic, tracking the edges of the crowd the way a veteran scans a perimeter without thinking about it. Mason's gaze did the same, and if you watched him long enough, you realized he wasn't staring at faces. He was watching hands, feet, exits, the distance between people, the little choices that reveal intention. The town respected him for it. The way small towns respect competence as long as it stays quiet and doesn't make anyone important uncomfortable. They called him steady. They said he'd served overseas, came home, and chose to keep serving because some people never stop standing post. They also said he was lucky to have a dog like Riot. Mason never corrected them. Luck had nothing to do with it. Riot had been trained, tested, bonded, sharpened by hundreds of hours, and a handler who listened when the dog went still. Today the docket was supposed to be easy. That's what the courthouse chatter said anyway. Simple incident, quick testimony, wrap it up before lunch. A troubled drifter accused of causing a scene near the river road. An unreliable witness making claims too messy for polite conversation. The kind of case that lets local authority pat itself on the back for restoring order without digging too deep into what actually happened. Mason had heard the phrases floating through the crowd like perfume. Misunderstanding, exaggeration, girl got spooked. People love to gossip. He'd heard the other phrase too, the one spoken with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Let's keep this from turning into something. And as he stood under the awning with rain tapping a steady rhythm on the metal above, Mason felt the courthouse's polished veneer like a thin sheet of ice. Pretty from a distance, dangerous up close. He glanced down at Riot, and Riot glanced back. And in that silent exchange, Mason understood the most important truth of the morning. Whatever the town wanted to call simple, his dog had already called something else. The courthouse doors opened with a polite chime that didn't belong to the weather, and the little girl appeared at the top of the steps like a hush given a body. She was dressed for respectability. Clean cardigan, skirt pressed flat, hair gathered back so tight it pulled at her temples. Yet something about her didn't match the outfit. Like the clothes were armor somebody else had chosen. A guardian guided her forward, and at first glance, the adult looked like the kind of person the town trusted on sight. Glossy hair, perfect posture, a tailored coat beating rain like it had never met inconvenience. Smile calibrated to be reassuring. Too polished, too smooth. The hand on the girl's shoulder never left, fingers splayed as if to claim ownership, gripped just firm enough to direct her without anyone calling it force. The girl's eyes stayed forward, but they weren't seeing the flags or flower beds. They were measuring the distance to the door, to the deputies, to anywhere she might breathe without that hand. People on the steps noticed. Of course they noticed. A clerk paused mid-sentence. A reporter's pen hovered. A deputy's gaze flicked to the guardian's fingers and away again. The mayor gave a bright laugh at something no one had said. In small towns, silence could be a civic tradition, and this silence was practiced, shaped by years of understanding exactly who not to challenge. The air felt heavy with it, thick enough to press on the lungs, as if the courthouse itself preferred secrets to oxygen. Mason Ward stood just off to the side, under the awning's edge, letting the scene walk into his vision rather than stepping into it. He watched the Guardian smile, then watched the way it faltered for a fraction when it landed on him. Just a crack, quickly plastered over. He watched the girl's feet, the way they hesitated before each step, as if her body wanted to stop but permission had been revoked. Then he felt Riot change beside him. Not a twitch, not a growl, not anything dramatic. Just a shift so subtle you'd miss it if you didn't know your partner down to the breath. Riot's head lifted. His ears rotated forward. His eyes locked onto the Guardian like a magnet snapping to steel. And the rest of him went unbelievably still. No barking, no excitement, no fear. That stillness was a warning in a language older than words. And Mason's pulse answered it with cold clarity. Riot wasn't watching the child. He was watching the hand. He was watching the person attached to it. He was watching the space around them like it expected something to explode. The Guardian kept talking in a light voice. Something about doing what's best. Something about getting this over with. And the words were for the crowd, not the girl. Mason stepped forward just as they reached the threshold. Not in a way that challenged, not in a way that made deputies stiffen or cameras swivel, but in the controlled geometry of someone who knows how to move without creating panic. He angled his body between the child and the Guardian as if he were simply giving them room to pass, his shoulder blocking the direct line of pressure, his presence offering the girl an extra foot of air. His voice, when it came, was calm and ordinary. "Morning," he said, nodding at the Guardian with professional neutrality that didn't invite conversation. He crouched slightly toward Riot, hand resting near the dog's collar in a gesture that looked like affection to outsiders and like readiness to anyone who understood. The girl's gaze flickered toward him, quick, startled, hungry for safety, and for a second, her lips parted like she might speak. The Guardian's fingers tightened, and her chin tipped down, subtle as a leash being pulled. Mason saw the movement. Riot saw it too. The dog didn't break his stare. He simply leaned forward a fraction, planting himself in the doorway like a living threshold, the kind that says, "Not past me, not like that." Around them, the bystanders kept smiling and looking away, pretending the rain was the only thing making their eyes water. While the courthouse door chimed again behind them, and the polished veneer tried to swallow everyone whole. Inside, the courtroom's warmth was the false kind. Radiators hissing, bodies packed close, air recycled until it tasted like wet coats and old varnish. And yet the chills still lived in the corners, in the pauses between words, in the way people kept their voices just a shade too polite. Mason took his seat near the aisle with Riot at heel, letting the room settle around them like a lid sliding into place. A bailiff called names. A clerk moved stacks of folders from one table to another, and the judge, gray-haired, unreadable, flipped through paperwork with the steady rhythm of someone determined to treat this day like any other. The Guardian placed the girl in the front row, close enough to be seen, close enough to be controlled, her hand never fully leaving the child's shoulder, even when she pretended to smooth the cardigan or tuck a stray hair behind an ear. The girl's posture stayed upright, but her eyes kept darting to the exits, to the adult's hands, to Riot's still silhouette like a lighthouse in fog. Then came the lull, the tiny, ordinary gap in proceedings, when papers were shuffled, when the clerk leaned down to whisper to the prosecutor, when the hallway door chimed softly as someone stepped out and another stepped in. It was the kind of moment everyone treated like background noise. The girl used it like a lifeline. She slid off the bench and edged toward Riot with a careful, almost rehearsed stealth, moving the way a child moves when she's learned that sudden motions get punished. The guardian's head turned just long enough to exchange a smile with someone across the aisle. And in that sliver of inattention, the girl reached the dog. She didn't pet him. She didn't ask permission. She leaned in close, cheek near the warm fur at his neck, and whispered into his ear like she was speaking to the only creature in the room that couldn't be bribed, couldn't be threatened, couldn't be convinced to look away. Mason caught only the movement of her lips, not the words. But Riot caught everything. The dog's body stiffened so fast it looked like a switch had been flipped. Muscles locked under the vest. Breath paused. Ears snapped forward. For one heartbeat, he was a statue. Perfect control, perfect containment. And then his gaze darted, sharp and deliberate, not scanning randomly, but landing with surgical certainty on a man seated 2 rows back near the center. A man the room treated like furniture, always there, always important, never questioned. He wore a crisp suit and an easy grin, the kind that made locals nod as if being noticed by him was a privilege. And when he shifted, people shifted with him, unconsciously making space. Untouchable. Riot's eyes pinned him anyway, and a low sound gathered in the dog's chest. Not a bark, not even a growl yet. More like the beginning of thunder you feel before you hear. Mason's spine went cold. He knew Riot's cues the way he knew his own reflexes. This wasn't a dog reacting to nerves or sudden movement. This was an alert. A lock. A verdict delivered without words. Mason's gaze followed Riot's line and met the man's smile just as it faltered for a fraction of a second, as if the dog's attention had brushed against a nerve. The guardian noticed then, too late, and snapped the girl back with a whisper that looked gentle and felt like a hook. The girl returned to her seat without protest, but her eyes stayed on Riot as if begging him to hold the truth steady. Mason's mind clicked through possibilities in disciplined flashes. Who is that? Why would Riot fixate on him? What did the girl say? He realized, with a sick certainty, that the whisper hadn't been a child's comfort-seeking confession. It had been a message, a placement of blame, a direction, targeted. Mason's eyes dropped, hungry for context. And that's when he saw it. Just a small detail, easy to miss if you weren't trained to look for the objects people use to tell you who they are. The man's hand rested on the bench rail, fingers relaxed, and on his ring finger was a heavy signet ring stamped with an insignia. The courthouse seal intertwined with a stylized star. Authority braided into tradition, glinting under fluorescent light like it had nothing to hide. Mason felt his stomach tighten. That symbol wasn't just jewelry. It was membership, access, protection. It meant the man belonged to the town's safe circle, the people the system bent around. Riot's gaze didn't waver. The hallway door chimed again. Someone laughed softly. The judge cleared his throat to resume, and Mason, staring at that ring, understood in one brutal instant that whatever the girl had whispered had reached the wrong ears the moment Riot reacted. Because the untouchable man's smile returned, thinner now, as if he'd just realized the dog and the veteran handler had become a problem. Mason didn't let his face do anything dramatic. No glare, no accusation, no sudden rush that would turn a courtroom into a stage. Because he'd learned in places far from this town that the fastest way to lose control of a situation was to advertise you'd spotted the threat. He rose with clipped professionalism, the kind that sounded normal to strangers and urgent to anyone who'd ever worn a uniform. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "I need a brief moment. Security matter." It was a simple sentence with an official shape, and it bought him movement without debate. Before the judge could even lift his eyes, Mason's hands were already working. One thumb tapped his radio to a private channel. The other slid his phone from his pocket like it had been waiting there for this exact second. His gaze never left the room as he took 2 steps back, measuring who watched him too closely, who relaxed, who leaned in to listen. Riot stayed seated, but his posture changed. Front paws planted, shoulders squared, head turned toward the benches as if he were holding a line. Mason leaned down just enough to murmur into the dog's ear, words too low for anyone else. Stay, watch, guard. The commands weren't loud. They were carved into the bond between them, and Riot took them like orders in a firefight. Mason backed toward the door, careful not to turn his back fully to the room, careful not to let the guardian's hand, still heavy on the child, disappear from his peripheral vision. He caught the signet ring again, glinting as the man shifted, and his chest tightened with the kind of cold that didn't belong to winter. Then Mason slipped into the hallway and let the door ease shut behind him with a soft click that sounded harmless. The hallway was quieter, but it wasn't safe. It smelled of floor polish and wet umbrellas, and the fluorescent lights here had a harsher hum, like they didn't bother pretending to be warm. Mason walked 3 paces, just far enough that the voices in the courtroom became muffled, and then, just once, his calm cracked. His breath hitched, sharp, involuntary, like his body was reacting to something his face refused to admit. He'd seen predators before. He'd seen systems protect them. The implication of a child whispering a name to a police dog in a courtroom, of that dog locking onto a man wearing the courthouse seal like a badge, wasn't just ugly. It was systemic. It meant the danger lived inside the walls. It meant the people who were supposed to keep the child safe might be the ones she feared most. Mason's fingers tightened around his phone until his knuckles went pale, and then he forced the breath out slowly, reassembling himself one controlled piece at a time. Mission mode. Move fast, say less, record everything. He stepped into a recessed alcove near a bulletin board covered in cheerful community flyers. Bake sale, toy drive, holiday parade, bright paper trying to mask rot, and he dialed a number he hadn't used in months, but never deleted. The line rang twice. A voice answered, low and alert, not local, not small-town friendly. Ward? Mason didn't waste a syllable. This is Officer Mason Ward, badge. He gave the number, crisp. I'm requesting immediate external oversight and response. Possible child endangerment tied to courthouse personnel. Potential evidence suppression. I need state-level eyes on this, now. He paused just long enough for the other end to understand the gravity. I can't trust local chain of command. I have a juvenile witness in custody of a guardian who appears controlling. K9 indicated specific subject in courtroom with courthouse insignia. I believe we have an internal protection structure. His words were procedural, but the urgency sat underneath them like a live wire. If I move wrong, they'll close ranks. I need you to initiate a discreet response team and preserve digital evidence, security cameras, dispatch logs, courtroom audio, entry records. Time is critical. On the other end, the silence shifted from surprise to action. Copy, the voice said, sharper now. Stay calm. Don't tip them. Mason swallowed, eyes flicking down the hallway as footsteps approached somewhere beyond the corner. Already tipped, he muttered, then corrected himself. Professional. I'm containing. I need a callback on a secure line. He ended the call and immediately typed a short message. Location. Names he'd overheard. The description of the ring. Thumbs moving fast, precise. Then he keyed his radio again, whispering into it like a prayer he didn't fully trust. Unit Ward to dispatch. Run a quiet background on. He stopped himself. Not on local. Not through their system. He swallowed the instinct and pocketed the radio, because every channel in this building might be listening. He turned back toward the courtroom door, and the sight anchored him. Riot sitting squarely in front of it, refusing to move, body positioned like a barricade. People stepped around the dog with forced smiles, but none of them tried to push past. Riot's eyes stayed fixed on the benches, on the guardian, on the man with the ring, as if he were guarding not just a doorway, but a threshold between a child and a predator. Mason watched his partner for one heartbeat, then set his jaw and started walking, because he understood something now that made his blood run cold. Whatever the girl had whispered, it had made someone powerful realize the truth was awake, and the next move would be theirs. Mason re-entered the courtroom like a man stepping back onto a minefield, with his boots already knowing where not to land. Face composed again, shoulders squared, expression neutral enough to read as routine to the untrained eye. He didn't rush to the front or make some dramatic announcement. He let the door settle behind him, let the room register his return, and then he did what he'd come to do. He tested the water by watching the ripples. His gaze swept the benches in a slow, deliberate arc, the guardian's jaw tightening a fraction before smoothing back into a smile, the prosecutor's eyes flicking down to his notes too fast, the court clerk's hand pausing mid-stack as if she'd been holding her breath. He watched the untouchable man with the signet ring, still seated, still relaxed, still smiling, and caught the tiny tell. The man's foot tapping once, then stopping when he realized Mason had noticed. Mason cataloged every reaction like evidence. Who flinched? Who looked relieved that he'd returned alone? Who looked angry that he'd left it all? Riot remained planted at the doorway, not blocking it with aggression, but occupying it with authority, and people gave the dog space without understanding why. When Mason took his seat again, he didn't look at the girl directly, didn't offer comfort that could be weaponized later. But he angled his body so that the aisle and the child sat within his peripheral vision. The judge cleared his throat to continue, and for a moment, it seemed like the machine of procedure would simply roll forward and crush whatever truth had tried to surface. That's when the compromised official stepped in. A bailiff captain or court administrator type, a man with a folksy veneer and a gut that suggested long lunches with the right people. He leaned toward Mason with a dismissive smile that pretended to be friendly. "Officer Ward," he murmured, loud enough for nearby ears to catch. "Let's not turn this into a circus. It's just a kid. Dogs react to nerves all the time." The words were sugar-coated, but the subtext was blunt. Stand down, play along. Don't embarrass the town. Mason kept his voice even, measured, the calm of a man who understood that volume was for amateurs. "I'm not making a scene," he said. And it was true. "I'm making a request." He rose again, addressing the judge with the same clipped professionalism as before. "Your Honor, I'm requesting a brief recess. 10 minutes. Additionally, I'm requesting the juvenile be moved to a protected interview room with a female court advocate present and a neutral officer assigned. Standard safeguarding." He let that hang, then added the next piece like placing a weight on the scale. "I'm also requesting preservation and review of security footage for the past 2 hours, entrances, hallway cams, courtroom feed, plus the log of who escorted the juvenile into the building." The courtroom shifted, a collective inhale, and Mason felt it. The moment the system recognized a threat to itself. The compromised official's smile tightened. The prosecutor's head lifted, eyes hard for a second before sliding back into civility. The guardian spoke up instantly, voice sweet and indignant. "That's unnecessary." "She's fine," We just want this over with." At the same time, too perfectly timed, the clerk shook her head. "The hallway cameras have been temperamental," she said quickly, as if rehearsed. Another deputy chimed in. "Interview rooms in use?" The bailiff captain chuckled, waving a hand. "We're all professionals here. No need to scare the child with all that." The judge frowned, not at the guardian, not at the ringed man, but at Mason, as if Mason was the disruption. "Officer Ward," the judge said, tone impatient. "This is a simple matter. Let's proceed." And that was when the truth hit Mason with the force of a door slamming. The resistance wasn't messy or accidental. It wasn't a lazy office shrugging off extra work. It was immediate, layered, coordinated. Multiple voices offering multiple obstacles in unison, like a chorus trained to drown out a single note. Incompetent stumbles. This moved like choreography. Mason felt his pulse slow into a colder rhythm, the kind that came when danger became clear. He glanced at Riot, who remained statue still at the door, ears forward, eyes locked on the benches, as if tracking the invisible currents in the room. Mason understood then that he wasn't negotiating with a court. He was pushing against a containment unit. The town didn't want the truth handled carefully. It wanted it handled quietly, smothered, redirected, filed away. Mason kept his face neutral, but inside, something hardened. If they were this fast to block a recess, what would they do to block a child from speaking? He looked again at the signet ring glinting under fluorescent light, at the way people unconsciously deferred to its owner. And he realized the most dangerous part wasn't the predator. It was the network willing to pretend nothing was wrong. The judge lifted his gavel slightly, ready to resume, and Mason made his next decision in silence, because the room had just told him exactly what it was. Not a place for justice, but a place built to keep certain people safe. Mason didn't argue with the judge, not because he agreed, but because he understood the rules of a rigged room. The moment you push too hard in public, they label you unstable. They isolate you. They take your access. And then the child is alone again. So he let the gavel fall. Let the proceedings lurch forward like a wagon with a broken wheel. And he started building something quieter and stronger beneath the surface. A chain. He watched the clerk stamp a form and noted the exact time from the wall clock. Watched which deputy opened the side door, watched who leaned in to whisper to whom when the guardian spoke. His hand stayed still, but his mind moved fast, stitching together timestamps and angles the way you map a perimeter in the dark. When the bailiff captain crossed the aisle, Mason tracked the path with his eyes and caught the moment the captain's fingers brushed the edge of a folder on the clerk's table. Subtle, casual. Yet the clerk immediately slid that folder under another stack, as if hiding it from view. Mason clocked it. He wasn't just watching faces now, he was watching paper. Who signed what? Who carried what? Who handled the girls' intake forms like they were hot? Riot lay at Mason's boot with the appearance of calm, but his attention was a knife blade, always angled toward the front row, always measuring the guardian's movements. Mason took advantage of every procedural pause. A sidebar, a document passed to the judge, a witness being sworn, to shift his position by inches and gather what the system assumed no one would notice. When the clerk finally rose to deliver a file to the bench, Mason caught the corner of the top page. A juvenile intake sheet with a signature line already filled. He couldn't read the name from his seat, but he saw the flourish, heavy pressure, confident loops, like the signature of someone used to being obeyed. He stored it away, another link in the chain. Then Riot changed again. Not toward the guardian this time. His head lifted and turned to the side door near the jury box, A door that, on paper, shouldn't matter. Just an access point for staff and deputies. A boring rectangle of wood with a brass handle. Riot fixated on it with that same unnerving stillness, ears rigid, eyes unblinking. And Mason felt the hairs at the back of his neck rise, because Riot only did that when something was wrong in a place people thought was safe. Mason followed the dog's line and saw what Riot was really pointing at. Above the door, a security camera mounted in the corner, but the lens was angled slightly away, just a few degrees off, enough that it would miss anyone slipping through that doorway with a child tucked close. It looked accidental to anyone who wanted to believe accidents happened. To Mason, it looked nudged, deliberate. He waited until a shuffle of bodies blocked sightlines, then leaned down and murmured into Riot's ear again, voice barely a breath. "Good. Hold." He scanned the room for a momentary blind spot and then, with the slow precision of someone tying a knot, he let his hand drop to the floor near his boot, fingers brushing the underside of the bench. Something hard and small was taped there. Mason's pulse ticked once. He didn't yank it free, not yet. He kept his eyes forward, posture unchanged, and used the edge of his fingernail to peel the tape silently. A tiny device slid into his palm. A cheap recording mic, the kind you could hide in a pocket, the kind that could capture whispers and turn them into leverage. It wasn't something a child could have planted without help. It wasn't something that belonged in a courtroom unless someone was listening. Mason closed his fist around it, warmth of plastic against skin, and for a second he felt the courtroom's polished veneer crack in his mind. Because now, he wasn't guessing. Now he was holding proof that somebody in this building expected secrets to be spoken and collected. He pocketed it with a motion so smooth it looked like adjusting his belt, then shifted his gaze toward the clerk's table again and noticed a folded scrap of paper half tucked beneath the edge of a stapler, like someone had tried to hide it in plain sight. The paper was small, child-sized, creased and recreased as if it had been opened and closed with trembling hands. Mason couldn't reach it without standing, and standing would draw eyes. So he waited, watched, and let the machine of the trial grind on while he planned. When the bailiff captain finally stepped forward to whisper to the judge again, Mason seized the smallest window. He let Riot rise and reposition, just a step, blocking a line of sight, and Mason's fingers slid across the clerk's table as if steadying himself. He snagged the folded paper, tucked it under his palm, and returned his hand to his thigh. No one shouted. No one gasped. But Mason saw the guardian's eyes flick toward his hand, quick as a blink, and the guardian's smile tightened like a noose. Mason unfolded the scrap inside his pocket by touch alone, reading with his fingertips the indentations left by a pencil. A name. Not the drifter on the docket. Not the witness they'd labeled unreliable. A different name, one Mason had heard in briefings years ago, attached to a charity gala circuit and a community foundation, the kind of name that sat on plaques in school hallways. And beneath it, a location written in uneven letters. Boathouse, River Road, under the steps. Mason's stomach went cold. The whisper. The girl hadn't just warned Riot about a man in the courtroom. She'd given a place, a hiding spot, and a name that wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this case at all. Because if that name was involved, then this wasn't a simple courthouse incident. It was a buried thing, protected by seals and smiles, and the first domino had just been touched. The private room sat behind a door marked Records, the kind of bland label that made it invisible to most people, and the hallway outside was quiet enough to hear the building breathe. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with old coffee and printer toner, and the fluorescent light didn't buzz so much as glare. Hard, clinical, unforgiving. A small conference table held a neat stack of folders, a laptop open to a security feed, and a yellow legal pad already filled with bullet points in tidy handwriting. 3 people sat as if they belonged there. The bailiff captain with his folksy grin gone flat, a woman in a blazer who looked like she'd never raised her voice in her life, but could bury you with a phone call, and the man with the signet ring. Still smiling, still calm, his suit jacket unwrinkled like consequence had never touched him. They spoke in low tones, not because they were afraid, but because they were practiced. This wasn't their first cleanup. "We need to keep this contained," the blazer woman said, tapping the legal pad with a pen as if she were reviewing a budget. "No disruptions, no scenes. Optics matter." The bailiff captain gave a quiet chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Ward's making noise," he murmured. "He's got that dog sitting on the door like it owns the place." The ringed man tilted his head, amused. "Dogs react to energy," he said lightly, as if describing the weather. "And Ward? He's a hero type. Heroes need villains. Don't give him one." The blazer woman nodded. "Exactly. We frame it as routine. We frame him as overzealous. Liability control." She said the words like she'd said them 100 times, the way administrators say risk assessment before cutting corners that hurt people who can't complain. The ringed man leaned back, fingers steepled, signet ring catching the light like a wink. "The child will fold," he said, not cruelly, not angrily, just clinically like a prediction about a form being signed. "They always do when the room tells them to." He glanced at the laptop, where the security feed showed the courtroom door, Riot's silhouette like a sentinel. His smile thinned. "But Ward's inconvenient. Veterans have habits. He'll start counting exits. He'll start asking for footage. He'll start sniffing for a story." The bailiff captain shifted in his chair. "We can deny footage. We can claim malfunction. We already did." The blazer woman cut in, calm. "We need a stronger deterrent, a reminder of who runs this building." She made a note on the pad. "Reassert control." The ringed man's gaze slid to the windowless wall, as if picturing it. "Then we use Calvin," he said. "He likes an audience." The bailiff captain's mouth twitched with something like reluctant agreement. "Calvin's a blunt instrument," he warned, though his tone suggested he'd used that instrument before. "Blunt works," the ringed man replied. "He doesn't need to be subtle. He needs to be visible." The blazer woman closed her laptop with a soft click. "We'll give Ward a public correction," she said. "A little humiliation. Make him look emotional. Make him look unstable. If he escalates, we document it. If he backs down, we win." They weren't talking like panicked criminals. They were talking like managers handling a spill. Contain, neutralize, sanitize, move on. And then the door swung open without a knock, and the room's temperature changed. Calvin strode in like he owned the air. Big shoulders, loud boots, wide grin that tried to be charming and landed as predatory. His uniform was half regulation, his tie loosened like he enjoyed looking just shy of disciplined. He carried a coffee he didn't need and a swagger he couldn't turn off. "Heard we got ourselves a Boy Scout with a dog," Calvin said, voice carrying, hungry for laughter. "Ward still playing soldier?" The bailiff captain's eyes flicked toward the door, a reflex to check if anyone had heard. The ringed man didn't flinch. He merely smiled as if he'd ordered a tool and it had arrived. "Calvin," he said, warm, "we need you to handle a situation, publicly." Calvin's grin widened. "Oh, I love publicly." The blazer woman slid a folder across the table. "No bruises, no threats on record," she said evenly. Just pressure. Make him feel alone in that room. Make him understand the town's patience is limited. Calvin cracked his knuckles, pleased. So, I rattle the hero. I make him bark. Exactly, the ringed man said, eyes gleaming with calm calculation. And if the dog snarls, even better. Then we paint Ward as reckless. Calvin leaned forward, excitement bright in his face. I can do that. I'll do it with style. The bailiff captain hesitated, then asked the question that mattered. What if Ward doesn't fold? The ringed man's smile held steady, but his eyes sharpened. He will, he said. Everyone does when they realize who they're up against. He tapped the signet ring once against the table. Soft metal on wood, a tiny sound with heavy meaning. This is our courthouse, our town. We are the system. And then, like a blade sliding into the dark, the truth underneath their confidence flashed. They genuinely believed that. They believed authority was armor, that a seal could erase a child's whisper, that a veteran's discipline was just another lever to pull. They didn't know that Mason Ward had seen fear in places where seals meant nothing, had watched people in power crumble when the truth finally got oxygen, and had learned the simplest rule of survival. When predators think they own the room, that's when you stop asking permission. Somewhere beyond the record's door, the courtroom churned on, and Riot sat guarding the threshold, and Mason held a tiny recording device in his pocket like a spark. In that private room, the ringed man gave Calvin one last instruction, voice soft as velvet. Go remind Officer Ward where he is. Calvin's laughter boomed as he turned for the door. Gladly. And as the door shut behind him, the blazer woman murmured, almost to herself, he won't know what hit him. The ringed man's smile returned, thin and satisfied. That was the fatal mistake. Thinking a veteran needed to know what was coming to be dangerous. The countermoves came so quickly, they felt like a coordinated weather system rolling in. One dark cloud stacking on another until the air itself tasted like pressure. And Mason knew, without needing proof, that his request for recess and footage had triggered the town's immune response. It started with a call that shouldn't have found his number. His phone buzzed once, twice, and when he stepped into the side hall to answer, a voice he didn't recognize greeted him with the lazy confidence of someone who believed the line belonged to them. Officer Ward, the voice said, almost friendly, you're making things messy. Mason didn't speak. He didn't need to. The voice continued anyway, as if silence was permission. Small towns don't like mess. Folks start talking, careers get complicated, dogs get reassigned. You understand? Then the line went dead, clean and final, leaving Mason staring at his own reflection in the black screen. He slipped the phone away and returned to the courtroom with his jaw set, only to find the next move already in place. A patrol unit parked directly across the rear service exit, accidentally angled so no one could get a clean path out. The deputy at the wheel pretended to check his clipboard, eyes forward, pretending not to see Mason watching. Inside, paperwork began to vanish in slow motion. The juvenile intake folder the clerk had handled earlier was suddenly misfiled. The stack rearranged so neatly it looked intentional. When Mason asked, calmly, casually, to review the escort log, the bailiff captain smiled and said, "We'll locate it," like that meant anything. The guardian leaned close to the child with a whisper that made the girl's shoulders tighten. And when Mason requested, again, standard procedure to move the juvenile to a protected room, the judge's clerk replied too fast, "She's not available," as if the child were a witness stand that could be booked and canceled. Mason's eyes narrowed. Children weren't unavailable. They were taken. Riot felt it before Mason could even finish the thought. The dog rose from his sit at the courtroom door and pivoted, head snapping toward the side hallway that led to the staff-only corridor. His ears pinned forward, and a low growl rolled out of him. Controlled, deep, professional, just loud enough to cut through the clerk's murmurs and make a few heads turn. Mason followed Riot's gaze and saw a shadow pass behind the frosted glass of the side door, movement too quick, too close to the child's row. He shifted his stance immediately, stepping into the aisle as if he were simply repositioning for comfort. But it placed his body between the side door and the front benches. Riot pressed against Mason's leg, not for comfort, but as a signal. Someone's coming, and it isn't friendly. Mason spoke without looking back. Words for Riot only. "Hold." Riot held, still growling, eyes fixed, a living alarm that refused to be ignored. A second later, Calvin swaggered in from the side corridor like a man who had been invited to ruin a day. He wore the biggest grin in the building and carried his confidence like a baton, letting it swing in every direction. "Well, well," he said loudly, letting the room hear him. "Our war heroes got the dog on edge." Laughter bubbled from somewhere, nervous, obliging, then died when Riot's growl deepened. Calvin leaned closer, voice dripping with mock concern. "You okay, Ward? Seeing threats where there aren't any? That's common, you know, after what you've been through." Mason didn't rise to it. He didn't give Calvin the performance he craved. He watched the room instead. The ringed man's faint smile, the bailiff captain's satisfied posture, the guardian's eyes glittering with relief. Calvin tried again, stepping into Mason's space like he expected Mason to flinch. "Maybe you should take a breath," Calvin said, louder. "Maybe you should let the court do its job." Riot's lip lifted a millimeter, and Mason felt the dog's body coil. He put a hand on Riot's shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. "Back," Mason murmured. Riot eased a fraction, but his stare stayed locked on Calvin, and Calvin's grin faltered when he realized the dog wasn't intimidated. That was the mistake Calvin made, assuming fear was the only language a dog understood. Mason let Calvin talk, let him hang himself with words, then turned to the judge with calm precision. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I'm requesting the child remain seated. No movement until escort logs and intake paperwork are produced." The bailiff captain started to object, but Riot's growl cut him off again, and Mason saw what no one else noticed. The court clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, had gone pale. Her hands shook as she stacked papers that didn't need stacking. Her gaze kept flicking to the side door, then to the guardian, then to Mason, like she was caught between two storms and finally understood one would kill her if she stayed still. When the judge called for a brief sidebar, the room shifted, bodies rising, chairs scraping, and in that confusion the clerk moved, fast, decisive, terrified. She slipped around the edge of the benches and ducked into the alcove near Mason as if she were just retrieving a file. But her voice came out in a thin whisper meant for only him. "Officer Ward," she breathed, eyes glossy. I can't keep pretending I didn't see it." Mason didn't react outwardly. He only angled his shoulder to shield her from casual sightlines. "Talk," he said softly. The clerk swallowed hard, then slid something into Mason's palm under the cover of a folder. A small flash drive wrapped in a strip of evidence tape with a handwritten date, and beneath it a photocopy of a sign-in sheet. Her fingers trembled so badly, the paper fluttered. It's the camera export," she whispered. The one they said malfunctioned. I copied it before they lost it. And the log, this is the real log. The escort wasn't who they said. Mason's pulse hit once, heavy. He kept his face neutral while his thumb felt the raised ridges of the evidence tape. "Why give it to me?" he asked low. The clerk's eyes flicked toward the ringed man, then snapped back. "Because she's a kid," she said, and the words sounded like confession and prayer at the same time. "And because if you don't have this, they'll erase her. They'll erase all of it." Mason tucked the drive into an inner pocket like it was a heartbeat. "What's on it?" he asked. The clerk's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Not just him," she whispered. "Not just one. There are meetings, hallway footage, people you'd never expect. The courthouse." Her breath caught, and Riot's growl rose again as someone shifted behind Mason. "The courthouse is part of it. It's how they move things. It's how they hide." Mason didn't have time to ask more. The judge was returning to the bench. Calvin was watching him too closely now, like he'd sensed something had passed hands. Mason straightened, posture composed, and met Riot's eyes for the briefest second. The dog's stillness said everything. Danger closing in, exits blocked, truth in your pocket, and no guarantee you'd get out clean. Mason looked down at the photocopy in his hand, and the name at the top made his stomach drop. The ringed man's name was on it, yes. But so were two deputies, a city council aide, and a courtroom administrator, all tied to the same after-hours maintenance entry. A network. The kind that didn't just protect a predator, it fed one. Mason slid the paper away as the judge called order, and he felt the walls of the courthouse tighten around them like a trap being sprung. Because now he knew the worst part. The building wasn't the place the crime was being prosecuted. It was part of the crime scene. The shift didn't announce itself with sirens at first. It arrived the way real authority often does, quiet, inevitable, and suddenly impossible to ignore. It began with the courthouse doors opening and closing in a new rhythm. Heavier footsteps, clipped voices, a set of uniforms that didn't match the local palette of friendly smiles and loosened ties. Mason felt it before he saw it, the way you feel weather turn in your bones. And when he glanced toward the rear aisle, he caught the sight that made the room's polished veneer finally tremble. Two investigators in plain clothes with state credentials on lanyards. A supervisor in a crisp jacket with a patch this town couldn't claim. And behind them, a small team moving with purpose, not asking permission, not waiting to be welcomed. The judge's gavel lifted as if to protest, but the supervisor held up a hand, calm, commanding, and spoke with a tone that turned procedure into compliance. "Court is paused," she said, voice carrying without shouting. "State oversight. Preserve the room. No one leaves." The air snapped. Heads turned. Smiles died on faces that had lived on them for years. The bailiff captain rose halfway, ready to play the gatekeeper, but one of the investigators stepped forward and flashed a warrant packet like a mirror held to rot. "We're taking custody of all security systems, digital records, and evidence in this building," he said. And then he added the words that changed everything. Effective immediately. Power shifted in the room like a weight dropping from one set of hands to another. Mason stayed exactly where he was, composed, the way you stay composed when you've already accepted the worst and planned for it. He didn't look triumphant. He looked steady. Riot remained at his side, posture tall, eyes tracking, the living line between the child and anyone who would try to snatch her into silence. The guardian's hand tightened on the girl's shoulder again, instinct, panic, control. But this time, a state victim advocate stepped in gently and firmly, sliding between them with a kindness that held steel underneath. "Sweetheart," the advocate said to the girl, "you're coming with me now." The guardian opened her mouth to object, but the investigator's eyes pinned her. "Ma'am," he said, "remove your hand." The command wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The guardian's fingers loosened as if the air had turned hot, and the girl stood without being pulled for the first time all day. She walked to Riot first, just one step, and her small hand brushed his fur, light, grateful, before she allowed the advocate to guide her toward the side exit where real protection waited. Mason watched that tiny touch like it was a vow being honored. Behind the benches, the ringed man tried to laugh, tried to perform his way through the sudden loss of control. "This is ridiculous," he said, rising with that practiced confidence, signet ring glinting like a threat. "I know people. You can't just—" "We can," the supervisor cut in, holding up a sealed evidence bag that already contained a flash drive. Mason didn't flinch. He'd handed it over in the hallway a minute earlier, along with the recording device, quietly, cleanly, chain of custody established in the tight language of professionals who didn't need a courtroom's permission to do the right thing. The investigator spoke again, now reading names from a list, each one landing like a domino tipping the next. "Calvin Rusk." Calvin's grin froze. "Court Administrator Hensley." The blazer woman's face drained. "Bailiff Captain Dorr." The folksy veneer cracked. "And?" The investigator's eyes lifted, locking on the ringed man. "Graham Kell." At the sound of his name, the room made a noise like a collective swallow. People who had spent years looking away suddenly looked directly at him, and the expression on their faces wasn't admiration anymore. It was fear. Fear of consequence, fear of being associated, fear of realizing the system they trusted had been turned against them. Graham Kell's smile tried to hold, but it slipped at the edges when two agents stepped in with cuffs. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, voice too smooth. "I'm a pillar in this community." "You're a subject in an investigation," the supervisor replied, flat as stone. The cuffs clicked, and the sound echoed off wooden benches that had once protected him like a choir of agreement. Calvin, unable to resist, lunged into the aisle like a man trying to reclaim his audience with force. "This is harassment," he barked, pointing at Mason. "He set this up, him and his dog." He stepped closer, too close, chest puffed, eyes glittering with that desperate need to dominate. Riot didn't bark. Riot didn't snap. Riot simply stepped forward. One controlled, deliberate movement. Placing his body between Calvin and Mason, head level, eyes hard. The growl low and unmistakable. It wasn't rage. It was an undeniable professional warning. Another inch and the consequences would be yours. Calvin halted, mouth open, suddenly aware of the room watching him without loyalty now. Mason's voice came quiet as a closing door. "Back up," he said. 2 words. No drama, no threats. Just a command. Calvin's bravado collapsed into a muttered curse as agents took his arms. And then the dominoes kept falling. Devices seized, phones bagged, doors to records opened, the security camera angles corrected, the courthouse systems placed under external control. Officials who had smiled through everything were escorted out past the same benches where they'd once sat untouchable. And the bystanders, those fearful, conflicted neighbors, watched with stunned faces as accountability took physical form. Outside, the rain had eased into a thin mist, and the courthouse steps looked different, less like a postcard and more like a real place where truth could breathe. The little girl sat in a quiet office with a warm lamp and a blanket around her shoulders. speaking to a trained advocate who listened without interrupting, while a medical professional waited gently in the corner, and no one touched her unless she asked. Mason stood nearby with Riot, not hovering, not claiming credit, just present, steady, a protector at the edge of the frame. The girl glanced up at him once, eyes tired but clearer, and Mason gave her the smallest nod, the kind that says, "You did the brave thing. You're not alone now." The town, for the first time in a long time, exhaled. An uneven, shaky release, as if it had been holding its breath around a secret for years and didn't realize how heavy it was until it lifted. There would be court dates and testimonies and headlines. There would be neighbors arguing on porches and people facing the shame of what they'd ignored. Restoration wouldn't be instant. It never is. But it began right there, in the quiet aftermath where truth had finally found a path through the noise. Began with a child treated with dignity, with a veteran who refused to be bullied into silence, with a dog who listened when no one else would, and with one whispered message that didn't die in the air this time, because someone finally chose to hear it.